the Conduit. Welcome to you all, welcome to our members and to any guests who are here. If any of you are guests and would like to know a little bit more about membership, please feel free to speak to a member of our front desk team after the talk. Democracy and democratic innovation is a subject very close to our hearts here, and it's something we cover a lot in our programming and in our content. And there are lots of vital questions being raised about that at the moment. According to the Economist, only about 8% of the global population currently live in a full democracy at the moment, which is the lowest that figure has been at for about 20 years. And according to Cambridge, dissatisfaction with democracy is at its highest since 1995. So there's much to talk about today. And I think it's easy to see why that dissatisfaction might be there, given that we've seen in the last week the world's richest man dishing out million-dollar checks to try and persuade voters in Wisconsin. And we've seen protests against anti-democratic meddling in Turkey and Hungary and Georgia and Serbia over the last couple of weeks. So we have two very distinguished guests who are going to be joining us soon to talk us through democracy and the rule of law. But before that, we have a tradition here that we call an icebreaker, which is a chance for you to have a brief discussion among yourselves. So I would ask you to turn to someone who you didn't come here with and ask each other the following question. What do you think is the greatest threat to democracy today? So we'll give you a couple of minutes to discuss among yourselves, and then I'll bring down our guests. Thanks. Hello again. Hi everyone. Hello. Great to see that provoked such good conversations. I'm now about to introduce our guests. We're very lucky to have our two guests with us today to go into this in much more detail. Jonathan Sumption is one of the most distinguished legal brains in the country, a former Supreme Court Justice, distinguished historian and author. His books on the 100-Year Wars have won many prestigious prizes. Jonathan's most recent book on democracy and the rule of law is at the back there, and he'll be available afterwards to sign copies if you haven't got one already. And Clive Coleman is an award-winning journalist and former barrister. He has covered pivotal cases such as the prorogation of Parliament and the Hillsborough inquest, and they will be discussing today Jonathan's analysis of democracy and the rule of law, and how democracy is potentially open to more political manipulation now than it ever has been in the past. There will be a chance for some questions afterwards, so please have a think in advance about anything that you'd like to ask. And if you want to continue the conversation later, I'd encourage you to go up to the Ubuntu Lounge on the 3rd floor or enjoy the sunshine up on the roof at Rucola. But for now, less of me, and please welcome to the stage Jonathan and Clive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming along today. So we meet in interesting times. We meet in what some people regard as terrifying times, even times which perhaps presage the death knell for democracy. Just a couple of stats for you, but the economic, and I get this from Jonathan's brilliant book. The Economist Intelligence Unit reported not that long ago that nearly 3/4 of the world's population are living under authoritarian rule of one type or another. And the US is now ranked as a flawed democracy under that unit's analysis. We've seen autocracies growing out of democracies in Venezuela, in Hungary, in Turkey, and elsewhere. We live in an age of polarized opinion, hostility to dissent. Faith in democracy and its politics is undoubtedly, it seems, in decline, and there is an apparent rise in the appetite for authoritarian rule, a craving for strong leaders free to make bold decisions about the running of society and addressing its ills, unshackled by the checks and balances that are integral to democracies. Democracy is, it seems, fragile. It's a thin crust. And Jonathan makes the point in his book that it requires virtue, an ability to put common interests above personal ones. And perhaps most worryingly, disillusionment with democracy appears to be strongest amongst the young, where you might expect it to be weakest. There's never been a more important time for a book like the one Jonathan has rather brilliantly put together for us. It is a forensic examination of the fabric, the fault lines of democracy. And I'd like to begin, Jonathan, by asking you, if I may, how robust and healthy is democracy as a system for running and organizing society in the year 2025? Has democracy had its day?
Well, I don't think the basic dilemmas have changed since democracy began as a system of government.
Jonathan, I think you might need to just speak.
As a system, can I be heard? As a system of government in the middle of the 19th century. The basic problem is that it is a system of collective self-government which requires people, its essential function is to enable us, in spite of radical differences of opinion and interest, to live together in society without the systematic application of coercion. That's the object. So human beings being what they are, they will never agree about things. The object is to find a system of government which can accommodate their differences. For that to happen, our differences of opinion and interest have to be transcended by our common loyalty to a decision-making process, however much we might disagree with the result of that process. Now, that is a frame of mind which does not come naturally to human beings. It depends on not just rules, constitutional conventions. It depends upon a culture which has taken a long time to create, but would be very easy to destroy. And it is fading. Democracy was the creation of a rather special moment in particularly European history in the middle of the 19th century, a period of relative rationalism, of economic optimism, and of European domination of the world. And all of those three things have tended to take a knock in recent years. I'm not suggesting that the culture has disappeared, certainly not in Europe, but I think the ease with which it can be destroyed is currently being demonstrated in the United States.
Okay. Look, I'm just wondering whether it might be possible, I don't know how intrusive that drilling is sounding to people, but if someone from the club might be able to go and perhaps ask someone, the person operating the drill to stop or take a lunch break, that would be really helpful. Let me pick up on one of the ideas that you've touched on, which is people not getting on with each other. You talk in the book, I'm interested in, you talk about really some of the causes of what might be described as democratic fatigue. You talk about periodic elections, and you say that their virtue is that they marginalise extremism because parties have to occupy the centre ground. That dilutes prejudice. Representation disperses power, you say, and inhibits its arbitrary exercise. So no government really can diverge too greatly from what the vast middle ground of the nation feels and thinks. But you also go on to say that inevitably this creates a professional political class. Democracies are aristocracies of knowledge, yes. You say in the book, and elites are rarely popular. You cite Jean-Jacques Rousseau in relation to that. But I want to ask you, have many citizens in many democracies just had it with the sort of weary merry-go-round of one political elite replacing another? Is that one of the things that's causing the decline in sort of enthusiasm for the democratic system?
Political elites are an absolutely inevitable consequence of any consultative state, and in particular a democratic state. You can't have, I mean, politics is the essential mechanism of democracy, and you can't have democracy without politics or politics without politicians. By definition, politicians being people who are engaged full-time or heavily part-time with public affairs are going to be different from most of the people who elected them. They may have started very similar to their electorate, but they're not going to end up that way. It's a way of life which is totally different from the one that most of us lead. So this is an abiding problem. It's not, if it's a problem at all, it's not a soluble one. And this isn't a new insight. I mean, Aristotle identified this as the main vice of democracies, or one of the main vices of democracies, 2.5 millennia ago. And he said it was important to prevent the coming into existence of a political elite. That's why he proposed that office holders should be chosen by lot, non-renewable, and let me just silence that.
Either you've got a spring in your pocket, or that's a personalised ringtone.
No, sorry about this.
It is quite an ancient iPhone.
I'm sorry, I do not change my iPhone every year. But that,
which would be your democratic right, of course.
Failing to switch it off is, I think, a problem common to all iPhones. Anyway, where were we?
Let me. We were talking about periodic elections. We were talking about political elites. Am I right in thinking that your view is that there is really nothing readily to hand that could replace political elites that would be better for democracy?
Well, strong men create political elites. The difference is that their political elites consist of stooges and toadies of their own choice. And it's difficult to suggest that that's a better kind of elite than one which the public have chosen for themselves. But, you know, there is a feeling among the public that all politicians are out for themselves and basically corrupt. And that was basically a criticism that Aristotle levied against the political elites of his day. My own experience suggests to me that this is nonsense. Of course, there are a small number of politicians who are corrupt, dishonest, or whatever, but most politicians, I think, are honourable men doing the best they can
and
after their lights, and women, yes. But I mean, the point about the elites that we have is that they're organised in political parties, and in principle, political parties are phenomenally effective agents of national compromise, because they are drawn, their job is to maximise their electoral support. And they can't do that simply by appealing to their base. They've got to appeal to people outside their base. They've therefore got to be broad churches in order to survive. Now, we have in this country witnessed, and some other countries such as France are presently witnessing, a problem which arises when you only have a choice between extremes. And I have been extremely critical of the way in which the rank and file members of political parties have been allowed not quite to take over the show, but to have altogether excessive influence in it.
Can I just, I want to come on to that. I want to come on to Brexit in the UK and the involvement of groups, you know, like the UK Independence Party and momentum in the Labour Party, because I know you're keen to talk about that. Before we do that, can we just carry on with some of these issues or the causes of democratic fatigue? One of the things you talk about in the book is the unrealistic expectations that the public have of politicians. You talk about a rise in wealth, tax take, and government bureaucracies, which have increased expectations. The governments can do and cure absolutely everything. And you point out that that obviously is not true. It couldn't cure, certainly couldn't cure COVID quickly and controlling, or at all. And controlling borders obviously is something that it struggles with, just to mention two things. But can you just talk about how our raised expectations that the government can and should be able to fix every problem, and if it doesn't, it should be judged harshly? How does that corrode democracy?
Well, because the expectations are inevitably disappointed. I think rising expectations are a natural consequence of mass democracy. And a natural consequence of technical and organisational changes that have enabled the government to do very much more than it used to be able to do. And there is, I think, a widespread feeling that enough wisdom and enough money thrown at any problem will resolve it. There are some issues which, precisely because we are a democracy, are particularly difficult to resolve. An obvious example of that is climate change. Climate change requires a current generation to reduce consumption. Most of the measures proposed for dealing with it require the current generation to reduce consumption in the interests of a future generation. Well, now that's a very big ask, but it's got to happen. So there's an example of a problem which a democracy is much more likely to find difficult to solve than an autocracy. But the main problem, I think, is that high expectations of the state almost invariably run ahead of what the state is capable of doing. And the result is a tendency to lash out, to condemn the deep state, to condemn corrupt politicians, and to look for alternative ways of having your own way. There are various choices. One is litigation. And I've been critical in the past of litigation as politics by other means, particularly in the realm of public law. That's a problem that is, I think, in this country being improved. Another example is direct action, the mentality which says, I can't persuade enough of my fellow citizens to agree with me about, e.g., stopping oil, therefore I'm going to block the Dartford Bridge for 5 hours just to show them.
You're very, very critical of those groups.
Yes, absolutely.
Just explain exactly why, because some people might, for instance, think, well, you know, the suffragettes caused a lot of disruption. They chained themselves to railings. They dived in front of the King's horse in the Derby at 1913. That caused a lot of inconvenience and, disruption in people's lives. But actually, it raised an issue which ultimately strengthened democracy and didn't weaken it.
It deferred the women's votes for many years, in my view, because of the reaction against these particular methods.
You think the female suffrage would have come a lot quicker?
I think it would. I think it would have come certainly before the First World War instead of afterwards.
Okay.
The problem about direct action is that it is an offence against the basic principle of democracy, which is that you have to your views about particular issues, which will inevitably differ from those of your fellow citizens, have got to be transcended by your respect for the decision-making process. These people are saying, I am right, you are wrong, I can't persuade you, therefore I am going to make life unpleasant for you, as a method of, the logic is, if life becomes sufficiently unpleasant, then the government will introduce legislation which Parliament will obediently pass. Well, as a political and constitutional judgment, that is not a very sensible way of looking at things, but it is against the fundamental principle on which democracies work.
Okay. Let's pause for a quick show of hands. Who agrees with Lord Sumption's assessment of the actions of organisations like Just Stop Oil? And who would disagree with that? Okay, I think just probably even Stephen on that. Interesting. Okay.
Well, I think that illustrates how many people have lost the underlying culture that sustains democracy.
Okay. Well, a neat bookend from a former lawyer and judge, as you might expect. Can I come on to, you have a chapter on democracy and its enemies, and I think we're all rather exercised about the enemies democracy faces at the moment. You quote John Adams, the founding father, one of the founding fathers of American democracy, who said, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." Now, you say that democracies fail from within because people turn to authoritarian forms of government. They don't generally fail because there's a coup. They kind of rot internally.
Yes, what happens, I mean, there are, of course, cases where tanks appear on the lawn, but they're relatively rare. What normally happens is that the label stays on the bottle, the facade is there, but the culture which is necessary to sustain it disappears. In the United States at the moment, which is basically the laboratory at which all of these things are being tested, in the United States at the moment, the institutional framework which sustains democracy is still there. There's a president, there's a Congress, there are more or less imperfect, but more or less free and fair elections. There's a Supreme Court. But the will to make it work democratically is rapidly vanishing.
Is that what you mean when you talk about the collapse of the political culture?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what the political culture requires, obviously a prime requirement is that you have got to regard your fellow citizens who disagree with you as people who disagree, very unfortunate, rather than as enemies to be smashed. I mean, what is one of the hallmarks of the totalitarian mind is when people who disagree with you become enemies to be smashed. When you say that a democratic mandate entitles you to free yourself from all the constraints that any civilized state will impose on its principal office holders, so that you can have Trump saying to judges, "Who elected you? I've been elected. You must bend yourself to my will," almost in those words in some of his tweets. Now that is a symptom of the cultural collapse of democracy, not so much because Trump is saying that, but because so many people in the United States want him to say it.
Yeah. We're going to come to some of those tweets in a minute. So here's one of my theories about why democracy is under threat, and it's that online has basically changed human experience beyond pretty much all recognition. AI, I think, is going to rev that up. So that fracturing of the political culture is something that it's more likely to happen today. I mean, I'll give you an example, for example. I mean, it's not just the hate speak on social media where people, are in echo chambers, just, the algorithms are feeding them more extreme versions of their own views and everything, polarizes. But it's also, for instance, if you think about deep fakes, if I vote for Keir Starmer because I've heard him say something and liked it, and it's actually a deep fake, kind of the game's up for democracy, isn't it, in those circumstances? What I'm saying is essentially that the structures that have held democracy together, which are 17th, 18th, 19th century structures, are simply not able to withstand the tech onslaught that's being leveled against them.
I think democracy is capable of withstanding lies, including torrents of lies. The significance of social media is that it provides a megaphone for those lies. The founding fathers of the United States believed that they were very conscious of the Aristotle's principle that democracies fail because somebody comes along, a demagogue comes along, offers people the earth in return for absolute power. And that was how many of the Greek city-states lost their democratic constitutions. And they were very concerned that that should not happen to them. The reason why they thought it was impossible was that the population of the United States was too large and spread, although much smaller than it is today, and spread geographically over much of a continent. So they said, the demagogue would never be able to reach everyone. Well, obviously they reckoned without mass distribution newspapers, without broadcasting, and without the latest iteration of that, which is online media. I agree that online media have made it easier to tell lies, but people have been told lies in politics since the ancient world. I don't think that this is particularly new. I think that you've got to look for the real source of all this in the reason for their discontents. And I think the real reason for that is the crisis of expectations, which has hit the United States in a big way, because for 2 centuries it has had an almost unbroken economic good fortune. The obvious exceptions being the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and the 1930s. And it is reaching a turning point because its run of good fortune is becoming less obvious. I'm sure it will continue to get more prosperous, but its relative hard power and economic heft is going to decline in the face of competition from technologically highly competent and much lower wage economies like India and China. Now that is a very difficult thing for politicians to cope with, but cope with it they are being asked to do. So what we are witnessing is a crisis of expectations. And the problem that we have is that in Europe these expectations are even stronger than they are in the United States. In some ways we have institutional advantages that the United States lacks. In particular, parliamentary systems are much better at dispersing power than presidential systems, which concentrate executive power in the hands of one man, as Article 2 of the American Constitution does, and as the French Constitution does. I mean, that is why I would expect France to be the first country to go in the direction that the United States has gone. I think that we will be one of the last, because in Britain, in order to carry people with you in a parliamentary system, you basically have to carry a lot more people with you. Now that can be done. We witnessed this in the 1930s. It requires exceptional circumstances. But what really happened between the wars was that a long period, lasting about a century before the First World War, of optimism about improving standards of living, about what the state could achieve, came to an abrupt end. And the disappointment of The shattering of optimistic illusions is a particularly dangerous moment in the life of any democracy, and is the fundamental reason why most European countries reverted to some form of autocratic rule during the 20s and 30s. We didn't, France didn't, Scandinavia didn't, but that's it.
Okay, well, let's stay in Europe for the moment. You've got a chapter on the UK. I think most of us here probably live in the UK. I think most of us like living in the UK. We'd like to continue living in the UK, but we're a little bit worried about whether the fabric of democracy is going to start fraying. You say that the chief enemies of democracy here are economic insecurity, intolerance, and fear. And that's all been aggravated by, you say, low productivity, poor levels of investment, and self-inflicted wounds. You cite an ill-conceived Brexit and a highly destructive response to the pandemic. Can I ask you about wealth inequality, which is clearly a dangerous thing? You say it's, and I think you go back to Dante, who cast, was it the new rich into the lowest pits of hell?
Yes, indeed.
So it's not a new idea that there's been distaste for those types, but wealth inequality, you say, is a product of freedom and liberty, and that's why America is the world's most dynamic economy, but also its most unequal one. Can you talk about that tension in a democracy, how to temper it, and what happens when it becomes too extreme?
Yes. I think what undermines democracy is not so much the degree of inequality as perceptions that inequality is the result of capricious factors. All innovation, certainly all economic innovation, will tend to widen economic differences because by definition the innovation comes from people who have thought out something earlier than anyone else and will tend to reap the benefits. So the creation of Musks and the like is essentially the result of an economy which innovates. And that was the position in 19th century England, which was then the most innovative economy in the world, and it's pretty general rule across the world, except in those totalitarian states that are able to combine high degrees of innovation with high degrees of state control over incomes.
Yeah, progressive taxation.
Well, more than progressive taxation, but even China has had to accept a large measure of inequality domestically as the price that it pays for innovation.
But is there a point of elasticity where, if wealth inequality becomes too obscene, it starts to corrode democracy?
It depends what you mean by obscene. I think that people, by and large, accept considerable fortunes, provided that they have been gained in a way that they regard as legitimate. Nobody, or not many people, object to the large fortunes made by entertainers or footballers because they...
Or lawyers. Or lawyers.
Well, plenty of people object to the large fortunes made by lawyers, but their objections are not as vocal as those of bankers, for example. Now, that is because the perception is, I think it's wrong, but it is widely held perception, that bankers do not add value. They simply shuffle papers around, and the amount that ends up in their pocket is largely a matter of capricious accident. It's the caprice behind some inequalities that I think fuels objections to it. There is a theory popularized in particular by Piketty that inequality is the result of unearned rents inherent in the whole system of production. I find that most unconvincing, mainly because Piketty does not, I think, give proper weight to the dynamism of economic activity. It's not a zero-sum game.
Okay, so we need innovation and we have to somehow manage wealth inequality that results from it. Let me ask you about another enemy that we face here, fear. You talk about
Yes.
the growing aversion to risk, financial, whether that be in the form of financial loss, economic insecurity, sexual violence, sickness, accidental injury, and that health brings us to COVID. You say that for all the perils, there must be, people think that there must be a government solution, and if there isn't, then the government is deemed to be incompetent, and that longing for safety and security pushes us inevitably somehow towards a coercive or an authoritarian state, a protective state.
This is all connected with the whole question of expectations that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, yeah. It's okay. So, but what link high expectations with a lust or desire for authoritarianism? Because you're constantly disappointed, is that right? And then eventually you think, well, I just want a strong man who can
sort this out, break through all the kerfuffle.
Yeah. Okay. Intolerance of our fellow citizens, you also see as a threat to democracy here. We've touched on that.
I think we are. I mean, we are less tolerant than we were of dissent.
Yeah.
There is a greater tendency, of which direct action is a part, to say that because I am right, I am entitled to ensure that the system delivers my view rather than yours, even if most people don't agree with me. That I think is a significant problem. There's also what I would call a sort of moral absolutism, a feeling that it is the business of society to have a collective moral view about a particular issue. I mean, an example which I gave in my Wreath lectures is about animal welfare. Now, it is illegal in this country to cultivate minks to make clothes. And that is also true now of most of Europe, which have introduced similar legislation. Now, I can see that there is a moral issue here. Is it right to wear clothes which animals have been killed to create? The difference is that you can say, well, there's a moral dilemma on which each of us should be entitled to make up their own mind. It's a matter for each of us. But there are others who say, no, there's only room for one view about this, and therefore we're going to have legislation which imposes my view or someone else's view.
You say something very interesting about climate change that ties in with this. You say the logical outcome of the threat of climate change is not international harmony in the face of a common danger. It's a world of competitive despotisms.
Yes. Well, that is basically...
How do you get to that world?
Because while we are all, except for some marginal cranks, conscious of the problem of climate change, we are not agreed on the method of dealing with it. And there are important national differences in that area. For example, attempts to prevent deforestation in South America and Malaysia have been met by the argument, well, why should we reduce our standard of living and abandon our attempts to achieve the same standard of living as Western Europe or the United States, when this pollution was largely historically created by Europe and the United States. Malaysia refused to stop its deforestation program. Brazil allowed it to continue without actually taking a formal position on it at all. Now, the distribution of the burden of dealing with climate change is an area which is going to bring different governments with different economic models into direct conflict. And that is why it seems to me likely that we will never achieve harmony about what we do about climate change, even if we achieve harmony about the proposition that there is actually a problem there. And competitive nationalisms is probably the right description of the different directions in which different countries are likely to move.
It's pretty depressing.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. The whole book is rather gloomy.
Yes.
I should say that nobody would be more delighted than me if everything I've said in the book turns out to be wrong.
Yeah. Okay. We'll stick with the UK for a moment. Two of the most sort of significant national issues by a country mile are Brexit and the pandemic. And now you regard Brexit as an unmitigated disaster. You say in your book, words to the effect...
I don't think I used that word,
well,
but I think that it has been very unfortunate.
Okay. I think it was a little bit stronger than that, but anyway, I'm not going to split hairs with you on that one. So you said that, you made an observation in the book that the Brexit was meant to bring the Conservative Party together. In fact, it destroyed it.
Yes.
Do you think the Conservative Party is dead and destroyed? It was not entirely dead, but is it destroyed?
I don't know. I think it's too early to say. But I think that Brexit has undermined it enormously. First of all, because Brexit was very much a Conservative project, although one which divided the Conservatives. It was designed, as you said, as I've said, indeed as David Cameron said, to unite the Conservative Party by putting an end to a long-running dispute. Well, it didn't put an end to it, and probably never could have done, because I don't think that the issue would have died within the Conservative Party if the referendum had gone the other way. I think that it has, what it has done is not simply to lead to a great deal of economic damage, because there's no way in which access to 500 million consumers can be substituted by access to 50 million or 60 million. But it's also, I think, brought out the Conservative Party's inner demons, a lot of very extremist stuff, which I think is due to the shifting of the whole centre of gravity of the Conservative Party. The critical moment was the expulsion of 21 MPs who had made life difficult for Boris Johnson because they were not happy with the terms on which he was threatening to leave the European Union. That happened in November 2019, and every one of those MPs lost his seat, either because he gave up or because, having stood as an independent, he was not elected. Now, what is actually happening at the moment is that the Conservative Party has lost people on the Remainer wing, and it has lost people on the Leave wing as well, because inevitably compromises have had to be made, and there are a lot of people on the Leave wing who are more interested in going for the real thing being Mr. Farage and the Reform Party. So it has shed people at both ends of the spectrum, and that is something that it will take a very, very long time to recover from, sure, if ever.
You say in the book that Brexit might have worked if we'd become Singapore upon Thames, a very low regulation commercial area, nation state, I guess. That didn't happen because we like our regulation too much. Yeah, I'm not going to ask you a question about that. That's just an observation people might. But because what I want to get to, and you say this book is all doom and gloom, but actually there is a rare moment of optimism that I detected when you seem to be delighted that our system was robust enough to, in your words, spit out both Boris Johnson, who you describe as a sort of Trump-light figure, who'd sought to subvert democracy by means of, for instance, proroguing Parliament in the lead up to Brexit, and spat out Liz Truss, who you described as lacking the basic standards of competence and judgment required for high office.
Yes.
I'm sure she would. I'm sure she'd be.
I wouldn't expect her to agree with it.
No, I don't think she would. I think that she would regard that as harsh. But you do seem to take some comfort from the fact that our system got rid of two leaders who were destructive.
Yes, well, that's
and
what
we'll do so again.
That's what I had in mind when I said that I thought that we would probably be the last to succumb to strongmanism. I think that in the long run, unless attitudes change, we're quite likely to succumb to strongmanism. But it's much more difficult to do in a parliamentary system. What happened was that Boris Johnson lost the support of a majority of Parliament because he could no longer command the loyalty of his own people. And that was because the standard of his behaviour was unacceptable even to his own supporters. Now, the interesting thing was that Boris Johnson did actually run an argument in his last days in power, saying, actually, we've now got a presidential system, so it's completely unconstitutional for you to throw me out. And Jacob Rees-Mogg enthusiastically agreed with him. Well, I think the outcome of that particular argument demonstrates that we don't have a presidential system. It would be very damaging if we started having one unless we also equipped ourselves with a large range of checks and balances designed to keep such people on the straight and narrow. But Boris Johnson's departure from office, and to some extent Liz Truss's, is an indication of the strength of a parliamentary system.
Sure.
It's not good at ensuring that mountebanks don't get into power, but it is quite good at ejecting them when their mountebankery becomes too obvious.
That brings us neatly on to a country that does have a presidential system, the United States. You've got a chapter in your book about the decision in Trump versus the United States, which if I can paraphrase effectively, for the first time in 200 odd years, puts the president above the criminal law, in that if what he's doing is done in an official capacity, the crime doesn't really matter.
Yes.
It's just a question whether he's doing it in his official capacity, and if he is,
it's
he's
also
okay.
the fact that they defined doing things in an official capacity in a way that was tailor-made to get Trump off the hook. What they said is you don't actually ask what the president's motives were. That would involve a kind of investigation, which this whole rule was designed to avoid. What you have to do is ask whether what he did was the type of things that presidents do. So, for example, one of the allegations in the grand jury indictment was that he encouraged a mob to invade the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021 to break up the process of certifying the results of the presidential election. Now, the way that the Supreme Court approached that is to say, well, it is a function of the president to speak to his people. And so that's the only question you ask. You don't inquire into the question whether he was saying to an ugly mob, go and tear down the basic part of the basic edifice of democracy. No, that involves investigating motives, etc. Likewise, it was alleged that Trump had told the Department of Justice to invent all sorts of spurious claims and cases against those who certified the results at state level. Says the Supreme Court, the Constitution says that the President must ensure that the laws are observed. So for that purpose, he's got to speak to the Department of Justice. But you stop there. You don't ask, was he saying to the Department of Justice, invent a whole load of bogus claims so as to keep me in power unconstitutionally? That's an inquiry that is completely forbidden. So by a most extraordinary ironic process, the very fact that the President has a responsibility to observe, to ensure that the laws are observed, becomes a reason why he has complete impunity for his own breaches of them. As a piece of legal reasoning, it is really quite extraordinary, because it ignores the fact that usually the question whether somebody is acting in his capacity as president depends on why he's doing it.
Let me. I mean, I think people will take on board the incongruity of that piece of legal thinking, and obviously the Supreme Court is now very partisan and heavily Republican. One of the other things we're seeing in the United States at the moment is the use of executive power by a president in a way that it has never previously been used. And we're also seeing attacks upon judges. I'm thinking of the case of the Venezuelan alleged gang members.
Judge Boasberg.
Yeah, Judge Boasberg, who basically ordered a flight in midair to turn around and come back. And the argument was, and they used this 1798 piece of act, the Alien Enemies Act of that year. The Trump administration say, well, it was already, he had the power to do it, and it was already in international airspace. But then there was a wholesale attack on the judge. Trump called Judge Boasberg a radical left lunatic who should, quotes, should be impeached. That led John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to issue a rare slapping down of the president. He said, for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose.
Yes.
Where do we stand now? We've got you know, some very, very. I mean, in fact, one of Trump's advisors also. In fact, Trump himself since has talked about how, quotes, radical and highly partisan judges cannot be allowed to, quotes, stand in the way of justice. And Tom Homan, who was his border chief, told Fox News, I don't care what the judges think. So where does that all leave us? Because the courts are supposed to be a check on executive power. They don't have a standing army. They're powerful as long as people believe they're powerful. Richard Nixon, I think, had more respect for the courts than seemingly the Trump administration does. Where are we in terms of that constitutional balance?
The power of the courts essentially depends on 2 things. It depends on a culture of acquiescence in their decisions subject to appeal, and it depends on their ability to enforce their orders. Now, the only way that a court can enforce its orders is by a criminal process, namely contempt of court. But Trump is now immune from that.
Yeah. So
the courts could still enforce the injunction against the agents of the president, I think that some of the reasoning of the Supreme Court in Trump and the United States last year would suggest that anybody acting on behalf of the president has the same immunity as he does. But even if he doesn't, Trump can simply pardon them.
So how on a sort of danger scale, where do you think we are in terms of American democracy?
I mean, all constitutions will fail if a chief executive is sufficiently determined to break the system. That is what the sort of chief executive that the United States now has.
I've just got an eye on the time. Chris, do we have time for just one more question from me and then we'll go to the floor? Okay. I think people will be very keen. Sorry, we're trotting around the globe, but let's get to Hong Kong because that's been a big part of your life in recent years. I think people will be very interested to know the reasons why you departed from the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeals. Some people would take the view that, look, from 1997, this was a slow-motion car crash that was going to only lead to one conclusion. Why did you join the court, and why did you leave it?
I joined the court because it is an interesting legal job. I'm interested in Hong Kong and fond of the place. I have a lot of friends there, and I joined it, therefore, I suspect, for the same reason as many overseas non-permanent judges joined it. That was in 2019. In July 2020, the national security law was introduced. And it was initially very uncertain how this was going to play out, because the national security law contains in Article 4 a very extensive safeguard for the whole gamut of civil rights as already incorporated in Hong Kong law. It seemed to me that the national security law was capable of being enforced by the courts in a way that was acceptable. That is not what's happened. Article 4 has hardly been mentioned in the various criminal cases on the national security law, and where it has been mentioned, only lip service has been paid to it. There had been a number of decisions by district court judges, which is the lowest tier of the criminal justice system in Hong Kong, in which had basically convicted people whose guilt was extremely doubtful. All that was certain was that they'd said things that were unwelcome to the government. It seemed to me right to wait until those were taken by way of appeal to higher courts. And one has to remember that district judges are hand-picked to decide national security law cases. There were, when I was there, 42 of them, only about 4 or 5 of whom were licensed by the chief executive to try NSL cases. So he naturally chose the ones that were most politically congenial to him. That's not so much of a problem in the High Court. There are, or were at my time, only 11 criminal judges in the High Court, and to carry out the business, they've all had to be certified. In the Court of Final Appeal, the court sits pretty well in bank. There are 4 justices, and with 1 overseas judge, they all sit there all the time, so there's no choice but to certify them. So it seemed to me that there was no reason to despair simply because district judges made some unusually savage decisions. The case which changed my view and persuaded me that it was hopeless was the decision in the 47 democracy activists case, because they were convicted of using the express rights in the Constitution for purposes unwelcome to the government. They were convicted of having plotted to disrupt the government by forcing the resignation of the chief executive. The Constitution of Hong Kong, the basic law, provides that the chief executive must resign if his budget is defeated, and the right to vote against the budget is a right vested in the Legislative Council. What the decision meant was that it would be a criminal offence for a elected member of the Legislative Council to vote against the budget for other than purely budgetary reasons. Couldn't vote against it because you thought that the government was not worthy of confidence or of being allowed to levy tax revenues. Now, it seemed to me that that decision was so deficient in basic logic, I was unable to explain it otherwise than by an unwillingness to stand up to the Chinese government in particular.
Is Hong Kong now, I think the phrase used in your book, and I'm just trying to remember whether this is one you were just positing or whether it was one you were adopting, is it an Orwellian authoritarian state?
Not in all areas, but it is in areas which the Chinese government feels strongly about. And those are areas which affect a relatively small number of people, although they are important areas. They concern the constitution, the democracy in Hong Kong, and so on. I remember very vividly discussing this with a very senior judge before the 47 democracy activists case in the Court of Appeal, who said, look, the problem is that under the basic law and under the national security law, the Chinese legislature's relevant committee has the power to give interpretations on the meaning of these laws. They can always, therefore, effectively overrule us. We are part of China. We live in an area of the world dominated by China politically and economically. We can't run a continual guerrilla war against the Chinese government. Unlike you, he says, pointing at me, we've got nowhere else to go. Yeah. Now, it's hard to answer that.
It is. Let's have some other questions that are hard to answer, if we can. Yes.
Yes, we got one right back here.
Oh, sorry. Let's have one from the back and then we'll come down to that.
Hi there, just a quick question. So, as I understand it, last weekend, a group of activists who were planning a particular protest were arrested, had laptops and devices confiscated by the police. And this was taking place because the group intended to carry out direct action protests. So in this context of comments made earlier about direct action being anti-democratic, is there an important tension there where if a democracy is pushing back against direct action activity, that is suppressing democracy and people's right to protest?
No, people are entitled to protest, but not in certain ways. I don't know, and I don't think anybody yet knows, exactly what the basis of the arrests was. If they were, I've no problem about people bringing their views about climate change to the attention of their fellow citizens. On the other hand, if they are going to try and obstruct other people in the exercise of their legal rights, then it seems to me that something has gone wrong. The reason why those particular arrests attracted so much attention was the police overreach about the manner in which they sought to arrest these people. The police in Britain seem to have an enormously strong taste for breaking down doors, even in circumstances where ringing the bell would achieve exactly the same result. There is a problem about some police forces, and that was an illustration of it. But I don't have a problem. I mean, if they had arrested them as they came out of the building, for example, and charged them with conspiracy to block roads illegally, I would have had absolutely no problem with that.
Question on the front row. I think that was the first hand up.
Thanks. Knocking down doors is only done when it's necessary, but that's another thing. You've spoken a lot about the state of politics in the United States, and my question concerns a third term for Trump. The 22nd Amendment, as we know, says no person shall be elected to the presidency more than twice, and that's fine. So the plan, as I understand it, is, and I'd just like to get your view on this, as to whether or not it's likely to work, to circumvent it, the simple expedient that at the next election, someone else, probably J.D. Vance, runs for president with Donald Trump as his number two. After J.D. Vance has been inaugurated as president, he promptly resigns. Trump becomes president again and appoints J.D. Vance as his number two. They swap places. Do you think that's got much of a chance?
Well, unfortunately, I do. Because the 22nd Amendment says that you can't be elected president. It doesn't deal with succession to the presidency by reason of the resignation or death of the incumbent. However, I mean, one must hope that Americans are sufficiently concerned by the obvious subterfuge not to vote for that option, but I wouldn't bet on it given the tribal nature of the United States.
Okay, next question.
We'll get one right back here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Afternoon. My question is specifically in relation to the United States as well. As Clive mentioned, over the last few weeks we had a rare public statement from Chief Justice John Roberts had a flavour of defiance to President Trump's call for impeachment for a federal judge that was against his migration deportations. Considering that both houses of Congress and the White House are under GOP control, it could be argued that the Supreme Court now has the strongest realistic resistance to some of the executive orders flying about. However, considering judges appointed, 3 out of the last 4 were done during his first term, and the party affiliations that they have, and the supermajority to the right, and also the success Trump has had within the Supreme Court over the last year, do you think we can expect any impartiality when these issues such as a third term or the end to birthright citizenship, issues that are enshrined explicitly in the Constitution, do you think we can expect any impartiality from the Supreme Court justices on this issue, or will they go right down party lines? And what steps, if any, could any member of the branches of government in the opposition take to try and reinstate some checks and balances and see them upheld?
Well, the Supreme Court is a very serious problem. I mean, I think one should be wary of assuming that the instincts of each of the 9 justices of the American Supreme Court are the same, even among the 6 of them who were appointed by Republican presidents. John Roberts is, although a firm Republican and party to the decision last year about immunity, is a much more independent-minded figure than most of his Republican-nominated colleagues. At the other extreme, Messrs. Alito and Thomas are an embarrassment. Amy Coney Barrett shows occasional signs of independence of mind. The Supreme Court has a long history of people being appointed for partisan reasons and turning out to be rather independent-minded. The famous example of this is Earl Warren, a former Republican governor of California, appointed by Eisenhower in order to consolidate the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, who ended up writing the judgment in Brown and the Board of Education and leading the liberal wing of the court for the next 50 years. It is, the liberal wings persisted for the next 50 years. He himself retired in the 70s. One must hope that eventually people who have security of tenure will turn against their appointer. That is less likely to happen now than it was in the 50s, because the Federalist Society, from whose ranks most Republican-appointed judges come, has made it its business to groom people for high judicial office over a considerable period. And it is now possible to identify a number of people who are so partisan that they will never adopt any kind of independence of mind. And that is a source of real concern.
I think there are something like 132 legal challenges to the various executive orders and other actions of the Trump administration is currently working their way through the courts. So there's a huge amount riding on the robustness of the courts.
Yes.
Just an observation rather than a question. Where do I have to go? I'm being
over to the right.
To the right, and then I know the gentleman down in the second row has had his hand up for a while. Yes.
Yep. Hi. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about migration. Would you consider migration and the rise in irregular and irregular migration, particularly under the Johnson government, as perhaps a third part of the failures that you spoke about, along with COVID and Brexit? And how do you see the future of ECHR, particularly given trends in Europe, the election of the German government?
Sorry, can you ask that question a
little
more slowly?
I was talking too quickly. Yes. So migration, you talked about Brexit and
Yes.
COVID as 2 of the failures of the Johnson government. Would you consider, I think, how people would perceive the loss of control of borders, migration as a third failure, and the second part is ECHR, how do you see the future of that, particularly with the election of a new government in Germany?
Well, I have strong misgivings about the role of the ECHR in domestic law, but I don't think that leaving the ECHR would make much difference to the problem of migration, because the basic issues are, in some cases, the problem is the Refugee Convention, which nobody is thinking of leaving. In most cases, the difficulty is the practical problem of finding a place to which you can send people who ought not to be here. I think that the ECHR has a marginal impact on the problem, but not very much. As to the new government in Germany, I'm not quite sure how that, obviously the problem in Germany arises not from the identity of the new government, but from the fact that 20% of the legislature is occupied by a relatively extreme party. I would not use the word neo-Nazi to describe Alternative für Deutschland, but it is clearly an authoritarian party which has made effective use of some of the classic failings of recent German governments, notably in the world of energy policy. I'm not sure that I've answered your question.
I think you largely have. Yes, gentleman there.
Hello. Thank you, Clive.
because you are Clive, and I was reading another great historian, William Dalrymple, on the anarchy, I wondered if you could possibly just give your view on the similarities between what something like the East India Company has done and what is happening now in America, between what I call Donald Musk, the cohabitation of Donald Trump and Elon Musk, corporations taking over society, big tech, AI companies, and using the power of large countries without necessarily democratic intrinsic principles to land grab, something which we've seen before. And you mentioned democracies and the challenges of the 1800s, but we have seen this before. And is it not the same thing that took 200 years for India to be occupied by a company known as the East India Company that will probably happen the same way if we allow what is happening now in America? And since this is about the rule of law, what is the role of the democratic citizen in standing up against, for example, America looking at anti-abortion protests in this country? What do we do about that? I'd love to hear your view.
I don't think there are any analogies at all between the behavior of the East India Company and what is currently happening in the United States. Both of them are objectionable, but for completely different reasons, and the mechanism is totally unrelated. What I think is true is that all autocratic governments tend to be international predators. The pattern is the same whether you're talking about Louis XIV, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Stalin, Mussolini, or Hitler. That is something that we are witnessing at the moment. The conversation that Donald Trump is said to have had shortly after his inauguration with the Prime Minister of Denmark, in which he is reported in the Financial Times to have said, "You might as well give me Greenland, I'm going to have it anyway," is pretty well the same as the conversation that Hitler had with the President of Czechoslovakia before sending the troops in 1939, and the conversation he'd had with the Chancellor of Austria a year earlier. I think that this is a source of very serious concern. On the whole, autocracy goes with predatory behavior of that sort. Talking about analogies, I have recently been reading some of Hitler's speeches in the two elections in Germany in 1932, leaving aside anti-Semitism, which is not something that you can charge against Donald Trump. There is a quite remarkable similarity, both in the rhetorical method and in the substance of those speeches, with those that Trump delivered when on the campaign trail.
Okay,
How are we doing for time? We've got time for a few more? Yep. Yes.
There's a lot of rhetoric from the political class, media class, about the need to safeguard democracy. And I think it's a term that lots of people balk at because they don't see why they should be fighting to preserve a status quo or a system which they don't see as yielding any dividends for them in their day-to-day life. But alongside that, I think there's a different movement around revitalizing democracy. And within that, you have things like arguments for single transferable voting systems, or for sortition, or for citizens' assemblies. And I was wondering whether you thought that those kind of mechanisms that connect people a lot more to democracy, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived practice, whether you thought that that might shift the dial on some of the skepticism that people feel about the current moment.
Well, I think you're right to identify skepticism as being an important factor. But it seems to me that you have to accept the fact, everyone has to accept the fact, that all governments are imperfect and all governments have limited power and in many cases can either not achieve some things at all or can only achieve them at the expense of other values which are also equally important to the electorate. The solution which is sometimes advanced is to find a way of avoiding politics. And it seems to me that this is a cop-out which is actually rather dangerous. I am not a fan of referenda unless they resolve the whole problem. But that's one method of circumventing the political process. The political process is calculated to achieve compromise between opposing interests and opinions. Referenda produce a yes-no answer, which is calculated to have exactly the opposite effect. Citizens' assemblies, to my mind, have no legitimacy at all. They are simply discussions between a random selection of citizens which are no more likely to persuade people who disagree than any other kind of process. They are, again, an attempt to avoid the political process. I think that we have got to recognize that we cannot do without politics. I think that we may well be wise to try and find a way of encouraging better people to go into politics. But I think one needs to remember that this is part of the imperfection of all governmental systems. In my view, about half of all MPs have always been blockheads going back to the 18th century. But the art is to appoint to government the other half. We haven't been quite so good at that lately.
All right. So we have time for one more question.
One more question.
Which is from our community, actually. So they ask, what's one thing that should give people hope after today?
Can we give half a thing?
I'm tempted to say I'll answer that question in 5 years' time. I think that there are marginal improvements which would be achieved, for example, by modifying the voting system in this country. But I'm not putting that forward as a general panacea. And I think that because the basic problem is a cultural rather than an institutional one, there is nothing that can be done other than to change our minds about some basic instincts that we have about politics. I hope that that will happen. I'm not optimistic about it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lord Sumption. Perhaps you'd like to... And just to say that we have really, we've done a little more than scratch the surface on some of the subject areas, but there is so much in this book. It is so clearly written. It really is, even though it's heavy stuff, but it is so clearly written that it is a really, really good read, and I thoroughly recommend it to you. I think Lord Sumption is going to be signing copies as when we come to a close, which is just about now. So if you would like a signed copy of Lord Sumption's book, he's going to be at that table to my right. Please go and get one. And thank you all for coming.